The next podcast is another podcast brought to you as part of our special bonus series produced in connection with Always a Pensions Angle by DG Publishing. This last podcast of the series is with Clair Alcock of the Scheme Advisory Board. We chat with her about the tremendous challenges that the recent consultation brought and how she sees the future unfolding.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the third of a series we're doing here on Always a Pensions Angle in collaboration with the 50 Faces podcast called the LGPS Interviews. I am Thomas Parker, and I am joined by Nick Reeve. Nick Reeve,
Hello.
How are we doing?
Yes, good, thank you. It's lovely and sunny here.
It's lovely and sunny here.
Excellent.
Very, very exciting. Let's hope it keeps up throughout March and into April and the summer months.
Indeed. It won't, but there you go.
Are you looking forward to this week's interview?
I am indeed, yeah. So this person has a big job, I think it's fair to say, with some pretty notable predecessors in the role as well, who've had got a big impacts, and they are in the. I'm probably stealing your thunder here by saying this, but they're overseeing a period in the LGPS where everything seems to be changing. There's so much going on, but I'm stealing your thunder, Tom. So why don't you tell us who it actually is?
It is, of course, if you are listening to sort of podcast, you already know the name because it says the name on the title of the podcast. It's Clair Alcock, Head of Pensions at the LGA and the Secretariat of the LGPS Advisory Board, aka the Scheme Advisory Board. Now, like all these interviews, it was conducted by Ethan Dellett of the 50 Faces podcast and took place at LAPSIF February. And the main theme of this podcast, this interview, is on governance. And Ethan started by asking Clair where this governance pressure is coming from.
Yes, it's a good question. So obviously governance has been evolving over the last decade. We've seen that with LGPS. And some of the changes that we're seeing now have come as a result of the Scheme Advisory Board's good governance work that was done in 2021. So they could already see that there were some better forms of structures that would be needed that would help governance. So in particular, some of those recommendations were around these LGPS senior officer, independent person. So to really think around actually how could governance really be transparent. So the board is, quite pleased that we've seen these changes. As ever, these that take a little bit longer than we might have wanted. That good governance programme was in 2019 to 2021. But that's what we're seeing now as a result of that. We're seeing, as those recommendations have come out, we're now seeing that pressure.
Great. I'd love to just dig in a little bit to each of those aspects and to really, in every case, ask what good governance looks like. Let's start with the senior officer. So do you think that is fundamentally different from the current officer structure? Will this be a growth of some of their responsibilities? Will there be more, perhaps, pressure, accountability on the senior officer role?
So I think that's exactly one of the challenges that different LGPS funds have at the moment. With a fund or LGPS the size of different 86, we have completely different sizes and shapes. So some funds have had a role similar to the senior officer for a long time. They're able to relatively easily now identify who that's going to be, and it's going to work really well for them. Other funds, the smaller funds, some of them typically are the London funds, are finding this new requirement a much more of a struggle. They're trying to think about who that is. And that's just due to the sort of the size and resource that they've had to work with. So we're seeing quite different responses across the 86 funds, which we would expect. So that in itself isn't something that's problematic. The LGPS is different shapes and sizes. But we're now seeing as a result of this that we're seeing different types of challenges challenges come out of that.
And one of the other key changes is this introduction of an independent person, which is quite distinctly said should not be the same as the independent investment advisor necessarily, although it could be if you could make an exception. It did compare it to the professional trustee role. And it seems that that role is evolving to be not just investment, but also administrative and governance related. What is your vision for what good looks like in that role?
Yeah, the independent person, I think, is something that's occupying lots of people's time in talking around what that can look like. And one of the struggles with that is it's new, and we may well see that in 5 years' time, we'll see that what the independent person looks like is going to probably different to how we're seeing some of the guidance now. One of the challenges, of course, is the pace of change. The changes are happening from April this year, and the guidance has only been released in a sort of a closed consultation. So it's not out there for everybody to really be thinking around that discovery time. So some of the challenges around the independent person, it has been referred to as an independent super person, because that person has to have the experience across all elements of LGPS. One of the particular things that MHCLG are seeking is more experience with regards to governance and administration, as well as investments. So it is going to be quite a change, and different funds are responding to that differently. We are seeing funds that have had, and I talked before about obviously some funds have got a more evident senior responsible person. They're probably further ahead in being able to appoint their independent person, because this is something that they might have been thinking around. The funds who are struggling more or thinking more around who that senior responsible person, senior responsible officer should be, really need to have that appointment in place before they can be thinking about independent persons. So the timeline is going to be quite challenging again, because they're both run within a 6-month period from the regulations coming into force.
And do you see this independent person as holding the administering authority to account, even the senior officer, or is it going to be holding the pool to account, or all of the above?
Yeah, and that's another, we talk about this sort of super person. There's also super responsibilities. Some of that is going to be very much led by the senior officer. Again, one of the reasons why the senior officer being appointed first is quite important in the independent person. There are lots of really good things that can come from that independent person in terms of being independent. It's not a political appointment on the pensions committee, and therefore there's perhaps a longer term that can be dealt with. So there's more stability there. So there's lots of, pros in this approach that the independent person will be able to give. But it is, a transition. There's a discovery here, and yet the regulations are being set as if we already know exactly who that's going to be for all funds. So yeah, there's definitely some challenges, and funds are working through those.
Let's move to the boards now, the board structure. And what have you seen in your experience is kind of optimal in terms of maybe a board size, having delegated committees, say for a responsible investing working group or an investing working group, and you're getting the balance right between representation, which almost everybody wants, and workability?
Absolutely. So I think, again, some of the changes that we're going to see from the new regime, and in the session before, we were just talking around investment advice as well, is we may see some of those committees change. So some of those committees which have traditionally focused on investment may well change. So we have more committees also focusing on governance and administration. So I think we're very much at a time of change. So we're thinking not necessarily how we've responded to the last 10 years, but what our future is going to look like over the next 10 years. And again, this is where the independent person may well be able to bring some experience to the committees to think around what that's going to look like. So we'd be expecting most pension committees at the moment to be thinking around responding to the sort of the new regime and having a think around what their structure would look like. I think because, as we said, there's different shapes and sizes, there is no one size fits all solution. And it is for the independency of each individual fund to think around what works for them. One of the key things that we need to be thinking around is obviously their relationship with their pool. Again, we know that MHCLG see the SRO as a key stakeholder with regards to that. And they'll also be needed to think about perhaps how their committees want to take place in some of the pool boards as well. So yeah, it's really is a change of changing time. Some of the old ways are going out, and when people will be thinking around what that's going to look like in the future. But we don't know that crystal ball isn't there. So we're seeing lots of different responses.
I think just to pick up on two things there. One is you mentioned the relations with the pool and that being something that will really need to be taken over from a governance standpoint. I suppose, how do you see the tension between the shareholder role and the client role?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's been one that, again, it will be a wrestle. And I don't want to keep saying about the SRO, but that's one other example of why the SRO is such an important appointment with regards to who is going to play that role and how they're going to then have their committees and their boards, the pension board work with that. And of course, it will be the different pools themselves will have some different ideas. So that is a tension that the fund is both a client and a shareholder. And we know that MHCLG have talked around the fund providing, holding the pool to account, which we'd expect to be done through the shareholder role. But we've also got them as a client. And as a client, they'll be looking at things like setting their preferences and priorities. So there's quite a lot there for the funds to be thinking about. One of the Scheme Advisory Board thoughts at the moment is how we develop the investment committee and the committee structure of the Scheme Advisory Board to be working with funds and pools on how they're going to do this. So again, it's doing that in discussion, and we'll look at whether we would need a pool steering group, whether that's a long-term thing or an 18-month to help manage the transition, to really get those kind of good practice discussions going, and funds can see how everybody else is responding to these challenges.
One of the questions we asked a member of one of the pools was about this self-efficacy check that the pool might do, i.e. would it hold its own products to the same standards as it would hold a third-party product? And, for example, taking those difficult decisions about maybe discontinuing a fund, winding one up, because it's no longer generating the return it says on the tin. And I would imagine in this shareholder client, conflict potentially, that will come to bear the accountability needed around products being offered in these pools.
Absolutely. So some of the advice that the Scheme Advisory Board took early on in 2025, just after the original consultation response from MHCLG was released, was around conflicts of interest, whether they exist and how to mitigate and manage them. And one of those is around, with the pools providing advice, but also implementing the investments. How do they make sure that they're creating the right infrastructure and ethical walls to ensure that they aren't going to find themselves in a kind of conflictory position? Again, that's something that the advice is in early stages of. We've taken advice in terms of whether there are conflicts. One of the areas now that we'd like to work with the investment committee and perhaps the pool steering group is understanding actually how do we develop methods to mitigate against any of those potential conflicts.
One of the last areas that it seems to be pretty much coursing through the regulations is around training and expert ability and the ability to provide that challenge within the committees. Equally, given the complexity of where we're going, both from a governance standpoint as well as even on the investment side, and as well as the standards of, say, a professional trustee, what would that look like? It seems like this training is quite a mountain to climb. How do you suggest that we'll get to that training standard that's required, and how quickly?
Yeah. So one of the changes that the Scheme Advisory Board is quite supportive of is the sort of the knowledge and skills aspect. So when governance changed and when pension boards were brought in 10 years ago, they had a requirement by TPR to build knowledge and skills that didn't apply to the pension committee. So we're keen that we've seen, we're supportive of the change, that actually there is a regulatory requirement for committees to have knowledge and skills. But as you say, just simply telling somebody to have knowledge and skills is not the same as then actually building that experience. So one of the other projects that the Scheme Advisory Board works on through its committees, one of its committees, the Compliance Reporting Committee, will has good governance working groups, and that's been looking at knowledge and skills. So that's been looking at how can that be developed? How can we work with what we've got? The other area that the Scheme Advisory Board is looking at is peer support. That's a really, big initiative that will really help develop and understand where the knowledge and skills perhaps are most needed and what offer can be made to help improve that.
And my last question is the crystal ball question, which everybody has been subject to. It's the kind of looking forward. We're going through a tremendous amount of change. And obviously it's hard to know what even the next year holds. But if you were to look at 5 years' time, when some of these initial birthing pains are maybe behind us, what do you think good governance looks and feels like in the LGPS then?
So I think the thing we're really looking for, and the thing that LGPS is already very good at anyway, is transparency. It's all around audit and transparency, and sometimes the danger is in not making decisions rather than worrying about the decision that they're making. And the best way to make decisions is to be really clear around what people are using to take into account to make those decisions, and having that transparency. So I think when we look in 5 years' time and we say, how well did this go? We won't be looking at the individual decisions, because it's almost guaranteed that in 5 years' time you wouldn't make the same decisions you'd make today. But it will be about understanding how those decisions were made and what kind of factors were in the market at that time that influenced the decision. And I think having a clearer understanding of what those 5 years have looked like when we look backwards will really help us prove that the additional governance has been worth the current pain.
Well, thank you so much, Claire. We clearly are on the edge of a brave new world when it comes to governance and structures in the LGPS. It gives me, as a representative of Administering Authority, great confidence to know that the Scheme Advisory Board, with yourself and your colleagues, are thinking so carefully about this and trying to really raise the standard so that we have something to follow and to look towards for advice and as a sounding board. So thank you for coming here and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Ethan, and thank you, Claire. Nick, what do you think of that?
I think the one thing that stuck out for me is that wonderful phrase Claire used, the independent super person, which it sounds like the latest chapter in the ever-expanding Marvel universe. But it does kind of encapsulate that challenge that the pools have. Does such a person even exist, with the level of knowledge in all those different areas that's required? And do 6 of those people exist, that can fill the same role at the different pools? My thinking is surely it should be a team,
I quite like the transparency stuff. I think that's I think that's going to be the thing that this whole governance. These whole governance reforms is going to be sort of judged upon.
I just want to flag one more thing on that kind of the skills and training, because it also made me think about, where are these people going to come from, but where are these skills? It's a problem facing across the industry, and I wonder whether you start to move away from a little bit, the decision making being purely on the committees, which obviously the people in there have lots of other responsibilities as well, and perhaps more equivalent to a lay trustee in the private sector, and perhaps we get more kind of professionalism in there. But that's probably a 3, 4, 5 year story there.
Absolutely. It'll be interesting to see how that progresses. Well, thank you very much, Nick, for joining me.
Thank you, Tom.
The Always a Pensions Angle LGPS interview special was hosted in collaboration with the 50 Faces podcast. Interview was conducted by Ethan Devitt, with the music being Drive Me Now by Mood Mode from Storybox.com.